The Japanese had prepared for every attack, except the one that should have been impossible. September 15, 1944. Peleliu Island, a sun-scorched fortress of coral and limestone in the heart of the Pacific. The air trembled with the thunder of naval bombardment. Shells screamed overhead, turning palm trees into fire and sand into glass. In a concrete command post beneath the Unbreakable Ridge, Major Kenji Iwata bent over a map, his hands trembling. Something was wrong. The shell fire was shifting, not toward the western beaches where Japan had built its machine gun nests, but to the east, toward reefs that every officer knew were too shallow for landing craft. That wasn't possible. He climbed to the observation slit, heart pounding. Out beyond the smoke and spray, he saw the glint of steel on the horizon, amphibious tractors moving straight across the coral flats. For months, Japan's engineers had sworn no invasion could come from that side. The reefs would rip any American vehicle apart. Yet here they were, advancing through the impossible. Inside the bunker, static hissed across the radios. No warnings, no intercepted messages, no sign of how the enemy had known. And as the first wave hit the beach, Major Iwata understood the horrifying truth. The Americans weren't just outgunning Japan's defenses, they were outthinking them. By the summer of 1944, Japan's intelligence service had grown confident. For years, their cryptographers had eavesdropped on Allied transmissions across the Pacific, priding themselves on the precision of their craft. In the early days of the war, they had torn through American and British codes with surgical skill, reading fleet orders, tracking convoys, and predicting troop movements before a single shot was fired. Their success had been a matter of national pride. Inside the windowless rooms of Tokyo's Navy Intelligence Bureau, mathematicians and linguists bent over endless streams of intercepted Morse, turning chaos into meaning. Many had studied abroad, in London, in Berkeley, in Paris, returning fluent in Western languages and confident that no cipher could elude their logic. They had cracked the British Black Code, deciphered Chinese transmissions, even infiltrated Soviet channels. They were not amateurs. They were artisans of secrecy. But by mid-1944, something began to trouble them. On the Pacific airwaves, a new kind of Allied transmission emerged, clear, unencrypted, spoken by human voices instead of machines. The rhythm was strange, the sounds sharp and fluid, the pattern beyond anything their algorithms could map. To trained ears, it didn't resemble English, or any known dialect from Asia or Europe. It was alien, yet broadcast freely over military frequencies as if the Americans didn't care who was listening. For months, Japanese analysts filled notebooks with phonetic guesses, marking repeating sounds, searching for linguistic anchors. None appeared. The language defied structure. No predictable grammar, no repetition that hinted at substitution or code word systems. It wasn't random, yet it refused to reveal any logic. The more they studied it, the more unsettling it became. This wasn't encryption as they understood it. There were no machines to jam, no codebooks to capture. These men were speaking naturally, transmitting coordinates, directing artillery fire, calling in airstrikes, all in real time. The voices carried the tempo of soldiers under fire, yet not a single word could be interpreted. Across the Pacific, Japanese officers began referring to it as the ghost language. The truth was more extraordinary than they could imagine. 2 years earlier, in 1942, the U.S. Marine Corps had quietly launched an experiment proposed by a civilian engineer named Philip Johnston, the son of a missionary who had grown up on a Navajo reservation in Arizona. Johnston understood something the military had overlooked. The Navajo tongue was a linguistic fortress. It was tonal, complex, and unwritten. It belonged to no language family outside the American Southwest. Fewer than 30 outsiders in the entire world could speak it fluently, and none of them were Japanese. From this idea, a radical form of communication was born. The first group, 29 Navajo recruits, arrived at Camp Pendleton in May 1942. Most were young men from the mesas and deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, men who had once been punished in government boarding schools for speaking the very language now being turned into a weapon. Working in secrecy, they developed a system that blended Navajo words with military meaning, a code within a language. Because Navajo lacked terms for modern warfare, the men created them from their own world. A tank became Chehi, turtle, a submarine, Beshlo, ironfish, a dive bomber, chicken hawk. They built an entire combat vocabulary from nature. Even the alphabet was disguised through animal names, A was ant, B was bear, C was cat. And to avoid pattern recognition, each letter had multiple equivalents. It was elegant. It was fast, and it was, for all practical purposes, unbreakable. As Marine units stormed beaches from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from Peleliu to Iwo Jima, these voices followed, short bursts of Navajo echoing through the static, carrying orders that could turn the tide of battle. A message that once required 30 minutes on a cipher machine could now be spoken, transmitted, and understood in 20 seconds. No delay, no risk of interception. Meanwhile, Japan's listening posts kept recording. They slowed the tapes, reversed them, analyzed syllable frequency, hunting for repetition that might reveal structure. Specialists compared recordings from different islands, hoping for consistency. Linguists consulted experts in obscure Philippine and Micronesian dialects, guessing it might be some indigenous Pacific tongue. Nothing fit. In a bunker on Saipan, Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Yamamoto, one of Japan's brightest codebreakers, educated in California and fluent in English, sat surrounded by reels of intercepted speech. For 18 months he had dissected every vowel, every pause, every breath. He had solved American ciphers before, but this time he felt something new, not challenge but futility. "This is not a code," he told his exhausted team. "It is something else entirely." He was right. What he faced wasn't complexity. It was unfamiliarity at a scale his discipline could not overcome. The barrier was not mathematical but cultural. After the war, during Allied interrogations, Japanese intelligence officers spoke of those months with a mixture of disbelief and respect. Major General Seizo Arisue, head of Imperial Army Intelligence, admitted bluntly, "We never broke it. We couldn't even identify the language." Others confessed they had assumed it must be an advanced machine cipher, so perfectly consistent were its transmissions, only to learn later that it had been flesh-and-blood Marines speaking freely into microphones. One captured cryptographer, when played a recording of the Navajo transmissions, listened in silence and finally murmured, "Whoever made this understood that language itself can be a weapon." He was right again. The brilliance of the Code Talkers was not only in secrecy, but in symbolism. They hadn't merely encrypted military data. They had embedded identity into the signal, identity born from a people who had survived centuries of attempted erasure. To the Japanese, who built their war machine on discipline, conformity, and cultural unity, this realization struck deep. The Americans, they saw, drew strength from the opposite, from diversity. A nation of immigrants, descendants of slaves, and native peoples had weaponized its own complexity. By 1945, more than 400 Navajo Code Talkers had served in the Pacific, taking part in every major Marine Corps operation. Not a single one of their messages was ever deciphered. Not once. The impact on Japan's strategic thinking was profound. Captured officers later spoke not of America's industrial might, but of its adaptability, the way its forces improvised, adjusted, and embraced the unexpected. "They fight without pattern," one officer said. "Their strength is chaos." For men like Yamamoto, the defeat was more than military, it was intellectual. The Americans had revealed a form of warfare that could not be measured by technology or doctrine. Some weapons, Yamamoto realized, were not built in factories. They were inherited through history. When peace finally came, the Navajo Code Talkers slipped quietly back into anonymity. Most returned to reservations, still scarred by poverty and discrimination. Many couldn't even tell their families what they had done. The code remained classified until 1968. Decades later, the U.S. government finally recognized their contribution. The original 29 received congressional gold medals in 2001. But the recognition, long delayed, could never fully capture what they had achieved. Because somewhere in the jungles of the Pacific, in the static-filled headphones of men like Yamamoto, those voices had already changed the war. Yamamoto survived and, years later, spoke with quiet admiration of the adversary he had never seen. "We believed we could break any code," he said softly. "But they did not give us a code to break. They gave us a language that belonged to a people we never knew existed." "How?" he asked. "Do you fight something like that?" The answer he already knew. You can't. They weren't the fastest runners nor the strongest warriors on the battlefield. They didn't fly the planes that darkened the Pacific skies, or command the ships that thundered across its waters. But what the Navajo Code Talkers carried was something far greater, the voice of endurance itself. In every word they spoke, they carried generations who had been silenced, yet refused to disappear. Their voices, steady, unshaken, echoing across the static, became proof that freedom's strength lies not in uniformity, but in diversity. While Japan's codebreakers searched for logic in machines and patterns in numbers, they missed the truth standing right before them. America's greatest code wasn't written. It was alive. Born from a language the world tried to erase, it became the shield of a nation fighting to stay free. And in those transmissions carried on humid winds over blood-soaked beaches, the message was never just tactical. It was eternal. We are still here. We are still speaking. And no enemy will ever silence us. That was the power of their code, not unbreakable because it was complex, but because it was human. Because it was truth. This was the sound of history speaking through the forgotten, and for those who listened, it still echoes today. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, the stories of courage, culture, and the voices that shaped history, subscribe to WWII Horizon and help us keep these echoes alive.